Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States, served from 1913 to 1921. He led the United States through World War I and gained lasting fame as a champion of world peace and democracy. A wave of far-reaching change came during Woodrow Wilson's presidency, defining the Wilson era as a turning point between the old America and the modern nation of today. Hi, I'm Anatolia Hotson at the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library and Museum in Staunton, Virginia. Woodrow Wilson was born right here in Staunton, around midnight on December 28, 1856. He was the third of the four children of Joseph Ruggles Wilson, a Presbyterian minister, and Janet Jessie Woodrow Wilson, the daughter of a Presbyterian minister. Young Woodrow was raised in a religious household where his parents stressed the importance of getting a good education. The future president did not begin formal school until he was 9 years old because he suffered from a reading disability that today we call dyslexia. Instead, his father taught him at home. When he was 17, he entered Davidson College at Davidson, North Carolina. He did well there, but after only 1 year, the Wilson family moved to Wilmington, North Carolina. Then, Woodrow decided to enter Princeton University in New Jersey, where he practiced public speaking, became a leader in debating, and read about the lives of great statesmen. During his senior year, he served as managing editor of the college newspaper, and in 1879, graduated 38th in a class of 106. By 1882, he graduated from the University of Virginia Law School and opened a law office in Atlanta, Georgia. He soon discovered that being a lawyer was not for him. Instead, he decided to become a college teacher, and by June of 1886, Johns Hopkins University had awarded him a PhD degree. In 1883, he met Ellen Louise Axon, who, like his mother, was the daughter of a Presbyterian minister. They were married on June 24, 1885. Together they had 3 daughters, Margaret, Jessie, and Eleanor. In 1890, Princeton University, his alma mater, invited him to become professor of jurisprudence and political economy. He accepted. The future president's reputation as a scholar and teacher grew steadily, and by June 9, 1902, he was unanimously elected president of Princeton University. Never before had anyone but a clergyman held that position. For the next 8 years, Wilson proved to be an innovative but controversial president. His radical new ideas attracted wide public notice, and that made him a perfect political candidate. At the time, the Democratic Party in New Jersey needed a governor whose honesty was above question. To the party bosses, Wilson looked like a good candidate. On October 20, 1910, Wilson resigned from Princeton to start his campaign for governor. He won by the largest majority a Democrat had ever received in New Jersey. As governor, Wilson furthered his reputation as a political reformer by changing New Jersey from one of the most conservative states into one of the most progressive. His reputation brought him national attention at just the right time. By 1911, the Democratic Party was seeking a presidential candidate to replace William Jennings Bryan, who had been defeated 3 times. The New Jersey governor fit the bill. When their national convention met in 1912, Wilson won the presidential nomination on the 46th ballot. The convention chose Governor Thomas R. Marshall of Indiana as his vice presidential running mate. That fall, Wilson faced the Republican nominee, President William Howard Taft, and the new Progressive Party candidate, former President Theodore Roosevelt. Although a minority of the voters elected Wilson to presidency in 1912, he received 435 electoral votes to Roosevelt's 88 and Taft's 8. At his inauguration, Wilson was the last president to ride to the ceremony in a horse-drawn carriage. In his inaugural address on March 4, 1913, the president promised sweeping change to laws governing tariffs, industry, and the banking system. Only 11 days after his inauguration, he held his first presidential press conference, saying the people were entitled to reports on the progress of his administration. Personally delivering his legislative requests, he called Congress into special session on April 7, 1913, to consider a new tariff bill. In October, Congress passed the Underwood Tariff Act, which lowered or removed taxes on many imported items. On June 23, he presented his program for reform of banking and currency laws, calling it the second step in setting the business of this country free. In December, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act, regarded as the most far-reaching money bill in the nation's history. In 1914, he established the Federal Trade Commission and passed the Clayton Antitrust Act. In 1916, he led Congress in adopting the Adamson Act to establish the 8-hour workday, the Child Labor Act to limit children's work hours, and began a new program of federal regulation of industry. And he started other programs to improve rural education and build roads. With the help of her 3 daughters, Mrs. Wilson made the White House as much like a private home as possible. She devoted herself to welfare work, literature, and art, and became the most influential person in her husband's life. But in July of 1914, Ellen Louise Wilson became ill and died unexpectedly on August 6th, sending the president into a depression that nearly cost him his life. In March of 1915, he met Edith Bowling Galt, the widow of a Washington jeweler. 9 months later, they were married. The second Mrs. Wilson was an intelligent and strong-minded woman who quickly replaced the happiness President Wilson had known with his first wife. The outbreak of World War I in August of 1914 stunned people everywhere. Most Americans wanted to stay out of the war, and President Wilson agreed. But a German submarine torpedoed the British passenger liner Lusitania, killing 128 Americans on May 7, 1915. Wilson had to take a stand. He began negotiations with the Germans, who ordered their submarines to stop attacking passenger ships. But in March of 1917, German submarines began attacking U.S. ships without warning. The United States could no longer remain neutral. On the evening of April 2nd, the president drove to the Capitol with an escort of cavalry. He asked Congress to declare war against Germany, insisting that the world must be made safe for democracy. 4 days later, Congress declared war on Germany. Woodrow Wilson proved to be a great leader in war, but his aim was always to bring peace. On January 8, 1918, in an address before Congress, he named 14 points he felt would help end the war. This included the establishing of a League of Nations to help prevent future wars. Only 10 months later, after he proposed his 14 points, Kaiser Wilhelm II gave up control of the German government. And 2 days later, an armistice was proclaimed. The president decided to lead the United States peace delegation to Paris to make sure that his peace plan was carried out. and to ensure the final settlement included a plan for the League of Nations. He was the first president to cross the Atlantic Ocean while in office, and when he landed in France on December 13, 1918, he received a hero's welcome. But at the peace conference itself, Wilson got only part of the provisions he wanted and had to compromise on several major issues. Back home, he discovered he lacked Senate approval for the treaty and his plan for the League of Nations. The president decided to take his case directly to the American people. Because of his weakened health, his doctors advised him against it. But on September 4, 1919, he began a speaking tour through the West and Midwest. On September 25th, he spoke in Pueblo, Colorado, then boarded his train for Wichita, Kansas. That night, he collapsed from fatigue and nervous tension. 7 days later, he suffered a paralyzing stroke. Woodrow Wilson would be an invalid for the rest of his life, yet he never gave up the presidency. When he did leave his bed, it was for purely formal functions. The First Lady would have to guide his hand whenever he signed official documents. The cabinet carried on much of the nation's business during Wilson's long illness. From his sickbed, the president watched helplessly as the support for the League of Nations dissolved, and Congress failed to approve the Paris Peace Treaty. Before his second term ended in March of 1921, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in Paris, but he left the presidency a disappointed man. For almost 3 years, Wilson lived in quiet retirement in Washington, D.C., bearing his political defeat with dignity and calm. On February 3, 1924, he died in his sleep. 2 days later, he was buried inside Washington Cathedral, the only president ever interred in Washington proper. Woodrow Wilson was one of the most remarkable men in American history, who had achieved success as an educator and astute politician before reaching popularity as a world statesman. He was a man of firm beliefs, who stood for integrity, purity of purpose, and responsibility.